Welcome to Sinful's Horror Stories. Today's video features true scary camping stories from viewers like you. Be safe out there. Sit back, relax, stay sinful. Number 1. A few years back, OG Dinosaur, an archaeologist, was among a group of people doing a survey in the middle of the forest. The crew had gone home and only OG Dinosaur and her boss were left to finish up some mapping miles away from the furthest town. They made their way out further into the bush, about an hour out. As soon as they arrived, the entire area felt off. OG Dinosaur and her boss pushed back the feeling away in favor of their work. About 15 minutes in, they hear a loud whomp sound. Both stopped, thinking the sound must have been their imagination. Then they heard it again. This time, it was so loud that they both felt pressure on their bodies and got goosebumps all over. They fled the site as quickly as possible. A decade later, thinking about it still freaks out OG Dinosaur. Number 2. The Kiesler and his girlfriend were on a road trip through California when they found a relatively empty campsite. They set up camp, made dinner, and went to bed. In the middle of the night, they were awoken by someone whistling outside their tent to the tune of "When the Saints Go Marching In." They laid in utter silence, hoping the singing person would go away. But then when the whistling turned to chanting, "When you sleep here, you disrespect me, and when you disrespect me, you disrespect the U.S. Marines," the Reddit user knew they needed to get out now. They quietly climbed from their tent into their truck and drove to a motel in the neighboring town. The next morning, they drove back to the campsite to retrieve the belongings they'd left behind. As they were leaving, they paused at a site adjacent to where they had slept, where a family had been staying. The family told the Kiesler that the singing had continued for another 2 to 3 hours after they had left, and it was one of the creepiest things they've ever experienced. Number 3. When Dr. Jim Danger was 18, he and his friends took a road trip to a national forest near Tallahassee, Florida. Their goal was to get away from people. So, they found themselves driving far into the woods. After they set up camp and had a few drinks, the writer and a friend decided to explore the surrounding forest. They found another trail and started following it. But the further they went, the more apparent it became that someone was living there. Eventually, they came to the campsite of an older man who was living out of his van. His clothes were strung up, coolers were scattered around, and a dog sprawled beside the van. The user and his friend tried to back out without being seen, but the man caught sight of them and called them over. He asked them friendly questions and offered up some places they should check out in the park. After about 10 minutes of talking, they returned to their own campsite. The man was a little strange, but seemed perfectly harmless. But fast forward 2 months, and the Reddit user's friend calls and tells him to turn on the television. There, on screen, was a man they met in the woods that night, on trial for 4 murders. Number 4. Jackman was camping in the Florida Keys near a quarry and an old dump site. One day, someone showed up at their camp and said they needed to move further from the dump site. He was planning on cleaning up the junk and burning some of the refuse in the area. The user moved, and that night the men started burning. Both parties went about their business. That night, the peaceful camping trip took a turn. They woke to the sound of scratching outside their tent. When they opened their eyes, their tent was covered in hundreds of rats. They shook off as many as they could before climbing from the tent. The rats had gone, but the writer was too freaked out to go back to sleep. Instead, they started a fire and stayed up for the rest of the night. The next night, the Reddit writer fell asleep hesitantly, but thought it would be okay because the men had finished their burning. Yet again, they awoke on the second night to their tent covered in rats. They used the same strategy, shaking the tent until the little critters fell off, and then starting a fire. But after this, they'd had enough. They packed up their things and headed back for the highway. As they were walking along the road, they came upon the dead body of a giant alligator. Suffice it to say, they had their fill of camping in Florida. Number 5. Itsura had just watched an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark about the Jersey Devil when their father took them hunting. While they were deep in the woods waiting for the deer to emerge, the Reddit user caught sight of a little figure in the background. It looked human, but because they were at a distance and it was dark, they could hardly make it out. Since Itsura was just 12 and it was 3 in the morning, the best they could tell was that the figure was 2 or 3 feet tall. For hours, the writers sat and watched the figure. The longer they watched it, the more they were certain it was the Jersey Devil. It had to be. When the two finally stood to leave, they walked toward the figure, and it was revealed what it was. A lawn gnome. Number 6. Every summer when Camo Panda went to visit their dad, the two would take trips into the mountains. On one trip, their experience left them incredibly uneasy. They were hiking down a steep slope when they saw an old rifle sticking from a tree. It looked like the tree had grown around the barrel many years before. They went to get a closer look and found a small cave. Inside, the two found a handful of aged personal belongings that made it seem as though the cave had once been inhabited. There were 3 cans of unopened food, a rusted cast iron pot, an old saddle and a bridle set, and a deteriorated wool blanket. They unrolled the blanket, and here's where things got very freaky. Inside, they found a shirt with holes and bloodstains crumpled up. The writer's father estimated the gun they found in the tree to have been from the 1870s, meaning whoever had been shot and most likely killed in those woods likely died around that same time. Number 7. Tex and their family were camping on a lake in central Texas. On the first night, they were playing Pictionary by the fire when they saw a light fly by over the lake. For a moment, they didn't think much of it, and instead continued the game. Then, another went by at the same speed, following the exact same trajectory as the first. They were reddish-yellow orbs with no sound coming from them. After about 15 of the orbs went by, a faster, smaller white one came in behind the rest. Then they were all gone. Not much was said about the event for the rest of the trip, but when they returned home, their mother looked up what the lights could have been. She discovered that people in a town a few miles from where they had been camping also reported seeing lights. No one had an explanation for what they were. Number 8. Test Pilot Beta went hiking with a friend in the Carolina mountains. They went far off the main trail, so by the time they set up camp, they were miles from any other people. They pitched their tent, ate dinner, and were relaxing around the fire when they first felt it, the sudden feeling of not being alone. After a few seconds, they heard something move in the darkness. The second time they heard it, the sound was louder, and they realized they had to be more than one thing. The two friends decided their best chance was to try scaring these things away. The user grabbed a handful of large rocks, and their friend took a thick branch from the fire. They both yelled as loudly as they could, then ran into the darkness, the user throwing rocks, the friend swinging his branch. They saw a dozen pair of eyes staring back at them. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they realized they had just charged a pack of mountain lions, who didn't even look fazed when 2 grown men ran and yelled at them. Number 9. Alex Drops went camping in the Allegheny National Forest with some friends, and one night they were sitting around the fire when someone or something started throwing rocks at their tent from somewhere in the darkness. Initially, they thought it was a group of pranksters from a neighboring camp. When they took a look around the camp, there was no sign of anyone but them. A few hours later, they heard a piercing scream. The two spent the rest of the night unsettled, but never discovered what had happened. Number 10. Cos Geo was camping in the high Arctic when late at night, from inside their tent they heard what sounded like pebbles rolling down the side of a nearby slope. Their first thought was it had to be a polar bear. They got up to look outside the tent and saw nothing. Somewhat confused but not too worried, they fell back to sleep. An hour or so later they woke to the sound of pebbles falling again. After a few nights of this eerie noise, they finally discovered what was going on. When the sunlight hit the frozen side of the slope, it loosened the pebbles that had been solidified by the ice. Then the pebbles would slowly start falling, coming in showers. But then, the rider began to worry that the next time they heard pebbles, it would actually be a polar bear, and they would have dismissed the pebbles as a natural phenomenon. Naturally, they didn't get a good night's sleep until they moved camp. Number 11. Border Trilogy is no stranger when it comes to camping, but when he and his wife wandered off the trail while backpacking in Maine, they had a rather strange encounter. They had prepared to be on the trail for 10 days, and so far hadn't seen another person since first hitting the trail. The couple had hoped not to see anyone else on their trip, so this was perfect. Normally, they just sleep under the stars. One night, because it was drizzling, they set up their little tent and climbed inside for the night. Around sunrise the next morning, he crawled from their tent to see a man standing about 30 feet from them, just staring. The Reddit user greeted them, but without saying a word, the man turned and disappeared into the woods. The couple were out there for another few days and kept waiting to run into the man again, but never did. Number 12. While camping in the Manistee National Forest in northern Michigan, Beer Hunter 420 saw something they'll never be able to forget. That year, they decided to try a new spot on the river that had better access for fishing and kayaking. They were miles from the nearest town, so the odds of running into anyone else were very slim. On their first day, they set up their tents and spent the afternoon by the river before returning to camp in the evening. They were sitting around their fire when they noticed another massive fire glowing through the trees about 300 yards away. Then the chanting began. When the Reddit user got a closer look, they realized it was actually a burning cross. 5 minutes into the chanting, gunfire started. The Reddit writer guessed there was at least 10 different guns going off, followed by yells. Based on the level of noise, they thought there had to have been at least 20 people. They packed up what they could carry and got out of that camp as quickly as possible. Number 13. One macabre cat went camping at a summer camp when he was 16. When he went to bed one night, the group stayed awake, chatting in their tent, when they suddenly started to hear heavy breathing nearby. He described the noise sounding like someone had just been sprinting and stopped right outside their tent. Trying to stay calm, he ignores it and keeps chatting. Then they heard, "Please help me." Everyone in the tent went silent. They heard the questions again. At this point, they were all freaked out. Then one of the braver kids turned on a flashlight and opened the inner flap to see outside. They saw a pair of bare, scabbed and pale legs standing there. It seemed as though the guy had been walking nude through the woods for a while. The man asked for help again, and the boy who opened the tent told the man to keep walking down the trail and he should find a ranger soon. The man responded, No, Rangers, they keep me here." One of the camp chaperones came out and asked the man a series of questions. The old man didn't answer. Instead, he started sobbing and ran into the woods. Number 14. Rylato was camping in Big Sur, California with one of their best friends one weekend. They almost had the entire site to themselves and chose a campsite about a half-mile from the ocean in a large open field surrounded by a forest. They spent the evening sitting around the campfire telling stories. Afterwards, the two climbed into their tent and fell asleep easily. Around 1 a.m, something startled their dog. She is usually very calm and used to being in the woods, but this time she was yanking at the leash, desperately trying to get away. She pulled so hard that her harness snapped, and she bolted across the field. The Reddit user chased after her into the forest, where they eventually found her curled in a random clearing. They picked her up and carried her back to the campsite. They all hid inside the tent, but the dog refused to lay down with her people. Her ears were up, and she was staring intensely at the tent wall. At this point, the Reddit writer and their friend were also on edge. The dog's behavior didn't make sense. Then they heard the cackling, a high-pitched laughter coming from outside their tent. They were so scared they could hardly breathe. Then screams followed the laughing. They thought it could have been wolves or a coyote killing their prey, but it sounded far too human. Their car was parked too far away for them to bolt for it, so they just listened to the freakish laughter till it faded away. Thank you guys for listening. Please be sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe for future Sinful videos. Happy 4th of July to all of my American friends out there. I hope everyone has a safe and fun holiday. And be sure to wear your mask. It's better to be safe than sorry. Follow me on Instagram at SinfulsHorror for all of your daily true scary stories. Until we meet again, stay sinful.